Everyone, thanks for coming back. Nancy, thanks for reminding us that we're going to record the session for those who couldn't join us live. This will also be available for you to go back to if there was a piece that you wanted to focus on. So today we are so privileged to have Nicole Gallego join us from El Pozo de Vida in Mexico. Welcome back, everyone, after the holiday weekend. We hope you at least had a chance to take a break and connect with family. Today's conversation is focused on El Pozo de Vida and the work of this nonprofit in Mexico City. Nicole is going to share with us how much they're doing to fight human trafficking, and her expertise in the field of social work is really, I think, expanded into the whole focus on our responsibility to society. And also, I'd like you to think about it in the context of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, right? Human trafficking is an area or an activity that's really targeted in a number of the different goals. While our focus overall as an umbrella for this program has been on health, good health and well-being, one of the things that we really wanted to focus on is that really everyone has the entitlement to good health and well-being. And people who are trafficked, taken advantage of, enslaved throughout the world don't have the same access to health and well-being, but yet should have the same rights. And so that's why we included this topic. And because we had access to Nicole and she agreed to come and talk with us, we wanted to include that as part of your perspective and consideration when you think about good health and well-being. It's not just for those who have access, but it's also for those who are being taken advantage of, who are being enslaved, who are being discriminated against. And we want to include that in your kind of worldview as you think about your relationship to the whole ecosystem. What's your responsibility to society? What would you like to work on in terms of next steps, both for yourself and for your community and your world as you see it? And this is one group that we would really like you to consider, and one aspect of your knowledge that we would like to expand. So Nicole, we are so grateful to you for joining us, and we're really looking forward to what you're going to share about your work with El Pozo de Vida in Mexico City and your perspective and things that you'd like us to consider.
Thank you. Do you want me to advance the first slides?
Please go ahead. Yes. They're familiar with the first two slides. That second slide, I suppose, was about who we are. And the next slide is just a reminder of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. We're focused on 3, but this is a little pivot to a new topic that we would like you to incorporate. So go ahead, Nicole.
Great. Well, thank you so much for the invitation to participate again with this program. I participated the year before, and I remember after my speech or my class saying, oh, it was too much information for 1 hour, but I think I did the same thing again this year.
We want it all, Nicole. We want it all. There's such a richness, both of your experience and also your perspective and the work that you're doing. So don't worry, we're ready for all of it.
Okay, well, I'll try not to talk too fast, and I want to leave a time at the end for questions because it's so enriching to be able to share perspectives and to hear other people's ideas and clarify any questions. But the original title of this session was The Structural Roots of Human Trafficking, and then I added, and what's new in the area of data, statistics, and research, because the anti-human trafficking movement just celebrated 20 years. It began in 2000 with the Palermo Protocol. And there has been so many interesting studies and new views and new data that's being analyzed in order to do the new 10-year plan to address the issue of trafficking. The UN just had a conference on it last weekend. And I'm not sure how many of you have participated or have heard any talks on human trafficking. They tend to say very similar things is what I have noticed. But now there is new data, new research that I found so fascinating that I wanted to share it with everyone here. So I'm going to be speaking a lot, referring to other studies and other researchers. And then I'm also going to be talking a lot about our experience here on the ground in Mexico City, which is where my organization is located. A lot of the data and statistics are internal on studies that we have done, but I find the information interesting and it's contextual. It's not a representative sample, but it can bring us new insights from practice to see how that relates to some of the overall structural studies. So an overview of my organization, it is called El Pozo de Vida. We're located in Mexico City. We were founded in 2010. We are a 501c3 in the United States, as well as a registered nonprofit in Mexico. Our overall purpose is to eradicate human trafficking in Mexico and Central America. I am one of the executive directors. We're actually a board of executive directors. There are local leaders, and then I do a lot of the grant writing and the program development. And because we are international, I participate in a lot of activities such as this, where the English is the required language. But all of our on the ground activities and intervention and programs are in Mexico City. And our organization started in 2010 with just a safe home for trafficking victims. That was back in 2010, and they did a needs analysis and found that there were no homes, or there was 1 or 2 homes in all of Mexico that were specialized in the attention of trafficking survivors. But with our experience and getting to know the survivors that we worked with and who participate in our programs, we began to expand because we saw the need to not just have restoration programs once survivors were rescued, but to prevent and to intervene in possible situations where trafficking is actually going on. So over the past 10 years, we've gone from 1 program to now 9, and they are all grouped into areas. We work in the area of prevention, intervention, and restoration, with the idea of having a holistic approach. I'm going to very briefly mention some of our programs. In the prevention area, we have a men's outreach program that's called OME, which means man in Castilian Spanish. And they work in the red light district of Mexico City, trying to reach potential clients and clients of sexual services. But they do a lot of, we consider prevention because they do a lot of prevention work addressing topics such as male violence, toxic masculinities, the deconstruction of some of gender stereotypes in a way of addressing the issue of human trafficking, maybe not in a direct way, it's an indirect, but it is a linked root factor of trafficking, which I'm going to go into that a little bit later. We also work with the migrant population, caravans that come through Mexico, and the detention centers here in Mexico City. We have a team, an interdisciplinary team that goes in to provide information on trafficking in order to prevent it, but they also try and screen and detect victims, and they report those cases to the government because they are eligible for certain visa rights as well as other services. And then we have a prevention program that works with populations that have been marginalized or are on the outskirts of Mexico City, where we've identified high levels of violence against women as well as femicides. And they don't just go and do talks, they actually engage the students in these transformation clubs, they call it. And they have the students themselves do a diagnostic of their communities and develop their own material to be able to educate their peers on the issue of trafficking. So that's a very dynamic and a very exciting program. And they've done murals, they've created so much material that we use in a lot of our outreach because it was actually designed by the population. Our intervention program, we have 2. We do community center. We have a community center for women in the red light district where we provide them food, we have workshops, we have therapeutic services, we try and screen for trafficking victims, and we accompany them if they would like to file a complaint with the government. And then we also do what we call block parties, which are outreach programs in the red light districts at night, where most of the activity goes on, where we create relationships with the women and we refer them to our community center. And in our restoration, actually one of these programs ended. So we have 3 now, which is a jewelry project that provides a work alternative for women who were originally trafficked when they were young, 12, 13 years old, but because of a lack of opportunities, because many of them dropped out of school because of their trafficking situation and they don't have work experience, they ended up going back into sex work because of financial need. So they aren't directly being exploited by a single person, but a lot of the systemic inequalities causes them to return into the commercial sex industry in order to survive. So there we see a lot of the systemic inequalities. And for those who want to leave, many of them are older, we have a work alternative program that focuses on jewelry making and other labor skills if they would like to go on to find other work. And then we have 2 homes, a refuge home for minors under the age of 18, and then a transition home for women who are coming out, or young survivors who are coming out of the safe home and can't go back to their communities or families. So that's a general overview of what we do. I've been with the organization 8 years now. I've been involved in many of the projects in different ways. But I would like to go into a little bit of the context of what we're talking about when we refer to human trafficking, especially in Mexico, because here, all of the research that I'm going to show you, all the data is based in Mexico. It's not on a global level. But according to Mexican law, they actually identify 11 forms of trafficking, which is important because we tend to think of trafficking as only sexual exploitation. And most of the programs work with sexual exploitation because that's where most victims are identified. But that doesn't mean it's necessarily the highest form of human trafficking. It tends to be the most identified because it has the most attention. It's easiest to identify. It also is very sensationalized. So there is more interest from the government or from other organizations to be in that modality of trafficking. However, the Mexican government identifies 11, which I find very interesting, or it explains the context of Mexico. For example, forced begging is actually identified as a separate form of trafficking, when in most international law, it's grouped in with forced labor services. But that's to highlight the fact that there is so many situations of begging, especially child begging or elderlies or the disabled in Mexico. So it is one of the identified forms, as well as forced marriage and servitude, the trafficking of organs, illegal adoption of minors, slavery, servant-like conditions, which those have different indicators to identify. One has to do a little bit more with debt bondage, while other is conditions of working without being paid. They also separate labor exploitation from forced labor. Labor exploitation, the victims can actually receive money, but it is below the minimum wage, and the hours that they work or the conditions that they work in are exploitative, even though they are receiving a salary. When forced labor and services they are not, as well as the concept of slavery. And then all of the forms of sexual exploitation are grouped into the third modality, which is the prostitution of others or other forms of sexual exploitation, which includes forced pornography or the trafficking of minors for sexual exploitation as well. And within the definition of human trafficking, in order for a crime to be labeled or to be typified as trafficking, it has to complete 3 different components. The what, which is the act, within the definition from the Palermo Protocol, which is the international definition that is most laws adapt into their own local laws. It defines that the human trafficking, or an act, or an illegal act that constitutes trafficking, has to include the act, which is the recruitment, the transportation, the harboring or receipt of persons, a means, which is through the threat or force of others, which is the how it's done, through coercion, through fraud, deception, or the abuse of power, and the purpose, which is for exploitation. In the Mexican law, it's actually modified the definition. They take out the means. It's an act with the purpose of exploitation, because they found that in trials, it was very hard to prove, or for the victims to prove, that they were coerced or that they had experienced fraud or the abuse of power. It was very hard to prove, and it became very difficult to prosecute cases. So the how is included, but it is defined by modality of trafficking, but they define it as any act, recruitment, or transportation for the purpose of exploitation. And some statistics. Overall in Mexico, they estimate that anywhere between 16,000 to 20,000 children are subjected to conditions of sexual exploitation. The percentage or the profile of the victims, 21% of cases were identified, male victims were identified, 51% were female, 8% were small children, male children, and 20% girls. And according to the UN, the local office here, 1 out of every 20 victims is rescued. So the numbers that we see as far as the amount of cases, that's only representing, or for every case that is identified, there's 20 that are not identified. And women and children make up 72% as of 2020, which is, I believe, we're missing 1% on this one, but in the most recent statistics, these statistics vary per year. It was the amount of victims that were female are 72%. And these are some statistics from our work here in the field in Mexico City. So we did a review of 25 different cases. We've worked with over several hundred, I don't know the exact amount, but it's over 200 or 300 victims within our various programs. But we did a review of 25 cases that were closed, and we found that the sex of the trafficker in the majority of cases, and 69%, were actually female, not male. And in the relation of these victims to their trafficker, the highest or the most common relation was that the trafficker was the victim's mother. And then after that, it was strangers, people they didn't know. And then it became, the next highest was family members, aunts and uncles specifically, neighbors, friends, social media, and then lastly, a boyfriend or a romantic relation. And the principal points of exploitation, this includes sexual as well as labor exploitation. The majority of victims were exploited in the private house of clients, of male consumers. Then the second highest amount was in the street, in different prostitution districts or red light districts, hotels, bars and cantinas. And then we actually found a lot of labor exploitation in restaurants and cafeterias. We found one or several cases where it was the victim's own home, even their own room. And then some isolated cases was a gas station. Once it happened in a school, it was the teachers that were involved, and then in warehouses where products passed through. And the average age of victims who enter into our safe home was anywhere between 13 and 17 years old. And to start getting into what are these structural roots, I think it's very important when we analyze these large crimes against humanity that are so huge. A lot of times we can become overwhelmed, and it's important to look at it from a systemic perspective and not just as an individual problem. You know, that the victims of this crime had certain life experiences that caused them to be more vulnerable, yes, but there are systemic issues and structural issues that we need to identify in order to have a macro level impact and not just on the individual level. So this analysis we did, all of our leaders and our project staff, we came together and we did this problem tree. I'm sorry that's in Spanish, I didn't have time to translate it. This is specifically focused on sexual exploitation, which is where we have more experience. But you can see that what we did when we were trying to analyze root causes, we grouped them into, we did sort of a brainstorming and had all these ideas that we put on a board, and then we began to group them. And we found that there were 4 major factors that contribute to the issue of human trafficking in Mexico. There is an offer, a demand, or supply, a demand. There are people who facilitate the act of trafficking, and there is an inefficient justice system. So when we talk about supply and demand, when referring to supply, we're talking about the situation of women specifically who are vulnerable to this crime. And what studies have shown in identifying the indicators for what makes certain populations vulnerable is they group them into 2 different areas. There's risk factors, and then there are vulnerability indicators or conditions of vulnerability. So those 2 are separated, one more by personal experiences of the victim that can cause them to be more vulnerable, such as previous sexual abuse or violence in their home. And then the conditions of vulnerability are more systemic, such as being born into extreme poverty, not having access to resources. And here's where we also identified that gender roles and gender inequalities also contribute to the vulnerability of women and the probability that men will become consumers. So when we're talking about Supply, we're referring more to women who are vulnerable to being recruited for trafficking, and demand are the men who are soliciting these services. And there we also identified, the further you go down on the tree, the more systemic the cause. So if you see along the bottom, well, it's in Spanish, but it's making reference to many different gender types of equalities, or the dominant forms of masculinity, sexual education through pornography, the construction of male sexuality, are systemic factors that contribute to the issue of human trafficking. And the facilitators refer to the traffickers who are gaining economically from the situation of trafficking, and because of the lack of a sufficient judicial system, it makes it a crime that is very low risk. There's a very low probability that a trafficker will be caught and tried. And as far as consumers, there's hardly ever cases of a consumer being sent to prison or being punished for the consumption of a trafficking victim, because it's very hard to identify if the person who is consuming from a person who is a victim or from an independent sex worker. Here again, we see the statistics that 72% of all trafficking victims in Mexico are women and children. 4 out of every 5 female victims are used for sexual exploitation. In Latin America, out of every 4 girls is married before she turns 18, which is another form of trafficking, is to forced marriage. And 98% of all victims of sex exploitation are women and girls. So what happens when we see these statistics, that this is a highly feminine crime, it forces us to analyze it from a gender perspective. And here is a sort of vulnerability chain that we constructed within our organization based on the cases that we were seeing. So we saw those root factors, but we wanted to understand some of the major national level studies identified the risk factors and then the conditions of vulnerability, but we wanted to see how that played out in our actual cases. And what we saw was a pattern that there was sort of this accumulation of disadvantages or inequalities that increased the probability of a person becoming vulnerable to trafficking. Trafficking doesn't discriminate. Any person can be a victim of trafficking, but certain groups are more vulnerable. And what we want to understand was why. So we created this chain based on our experience. And so the first level of factors that create vulnerability to trafficking is the gender factor. If you are female, if you're young, if you're an adolescent, if you live within conditions of poverty or marginalized areas, sorry about those spelling errors. I translated this from Spanish, so some of the translation or the copy had some errors in it. And then your racial ethnicity or your racial group can also contribute to your level of vulnerability. And that is the first level. So based on those factors, just those 4 factors, it creates the first level. Then we add to that, if the person or the individual is without access to education, and there is a lack of well-paid job opportunities, or that also the lack of education is linked to the lack of well-paid job options, that then adds to the level of vulnerability, and then they are now at a second level of vulnerability. And then to that, we add other factors such as previous situations of violence, political insecurity in the areas where they live, crime or community violence, such as organized crime or gang activity, which causes a desire to flee from their situation and to find a new community or a new way of life, or just to escape in order to be safe. And those added to all the other previous factors creates the highest level of vulnerability to being trafficked. And an individual doesn't necessarily have to pass all these levels to become a victim, but the more levels they go through, the more vulnerable they are to the crime of human trafficking. So now I want to talk a little bit, when we're going into the structural issues, there's a lot of studies on the survivors of trafficking and their profiles and their stories, but I really have focused a lot of my areas of research on the demand side. I find it really interesting and necessary to be able to link these root cause factors to the phenomenon of trafficking in order to have a higher level of impact, or to be able to prevent these cases from happening before anyone falls victim. So as far as studying the demand, what they have found, and what the most recent studies have found here in Mexico, and also some of my own research as well, is that male sexuality stereotypes and constructs contribute to the practice of consuming prostitution. So the gender identity and gender stereotypes and roles are directly linked to the consumption of prostitution. Male consumers of sexual services rarely can distinguish between female sex workers or independent sex workers and victims of human trafficking. That several studies, and I also found it in my own research, that there is a lack of ability or a lack of desire really to distinguish, or a lack of feeling of responsibility that they need to ensure that the person that they are purchasing services from is not a victim of trafficking. And there have been several studies, this was my favorite, that tried to do a typology of male consumers of sex services. So they group them into different categories or different types of consumers according to their motives and the processes that they use in order to consume and their sexual practice. So the first is the misogynistic client who objectifies women as a commodity. They're open about the inferiority of women. There's the client friend who does humanize women but still consumes. He considers them friends, or there's more of a friendship or a friendly relationship between them, but he is still a consumer. There is a consumer client, which this is actually the most common that I found, and that many of the studies are finding, is that this neoliberal capitalist view of sexual services, that sex is just like anything else, something that can be purchased, a commodity that can be purchased, everything is for sale. And the desire to have many experiences that are easy, that don't require a lot of effort, that don't have any commitment or attachments, is one of the leading causes or motives to consume, or why these groups of men would prefer, instead of looking for a long-term committed relationship or having just casual relationships with other women, they prefer to pay for it because it's just easier. It's less effort. And this is what one sociologist called mixed sex, like the idea of McDonald's, that it's a fast, easy, quick, cheap thing that can be purchased quickly with no problems, in and out, and then other experiences can be achieved later on. And then the critical client, who is a client who is aware of inequalities and regrets being a consumer of commercial sex, recognizes that human trafficking exists, that women are exploited, and a lot of times they don't stop consuming, but they do have a certain level of consciousness, or they have a criteria that they put in place in order to ensure that the women that they're working with are independent workers and not victims. And Melissa Farley, who's one of the leading sociologists who studied the issues of women involved in sex work and the violence against women and human trafficking, she, in one of her studies, found that the combination of hostile masculinity and impersonal sex, or the desire for impersonal sex, was found to be the strongest predictor of sexual assault or violence against women who are involved in the commercial sex industry. However, there are also many studies that have shown that most clients, the majority of clients, don't have like it's not a sickness or any kind of mental health issue for the reason why that they're purchasing services. They're completely normal men without any particular violent or inherent problematic characteristics. It's not any kind of distortion or any kind of sickness. It's just a normal practice. And factors that contribute to trafficking within this demand for commercial sex services, what are the factors that can contribute to trafficking? Here I am making the distinction between the commercial sex industry and trafficking. I do make a distinction. I know there are certain postures or certain views that consider all forms of sex work to be exploitative, and there are truths to those arguments. But in this case, I am making the distinction that there are independent sex workers that don't fall under the definition of trafficking. But how does this demand contribute to trafficking? Well, specifically, they have found that there is a preference of clients for younger women. So in Colombia, the majority of clients that were interviewed in a study expressed the preference for women between the ages of 18 to 25 and 4% for minors. And in Mexico, a study done with clients found that 50% of these clients who participated acknowledged having attended sexual services with minors. So if a minor is involved in the commercial sex industry, it's automatically considered trafficking. So even if these men aren't intentionally looking for victims of trafficking, the fact that they prefer younger women can increase the probability that they are purchasing services from victims of trafficking. There's also a preference for cheaper services. So the cheaper tends to reflect a more exploitative situation or situations that are much less safe. And these two factors combined generate a very high demand for sexual services from women in the most precarious situations. There's a very good sociologist who is a doctor, and Hurtado. She's from the University of Guadalajara here in Mexico, and she talks about the social construction of the sexual market. And so within what her theory argues is that the commercial sex industry is a social construct as well. And certain women within that industry have higher access to rights and privileges than others. So there's a hierarchy among the women as well as the clients, and the clients contribute to that social construction. So it's a phenomenon that encompasses many different actors, and that within it, we see that women, for example, women who work in escort services are less likely to experience violence or exploitation than women who are migrants and are working in very poor forms of street prostitution, for example. So she analyzes kind of this hierarchy and the intersectionality of this commercial sex industry. And it was her studies that found that these two factors of men preferring cheaper services and younger women also contribute to the demand for women who are exploited. So these are some practices or some case studies that reflect the practice of consuming sexual services, some tendencies that were found in some of this research. One, that the purchasing of sexual services tends to be an impulsive decision that is taken very lightly. This is actually from my own research. I interviewed a cohort of men who are consumers here in Mexico. And what I found was they had this very light, very, oh, it's no big deal kind of attitude when it came to their first. I was specifically exploring the factors and the processes of their first decision to purchase sexual services. I wanted to understand what made them go from non-consumer to a consumer. And they were kind of like confused by the question, like, oh, it was no big deal. Like, I just saw this offer and I had the money and I had the time. So I just decided to try it as if it was any other sort of purchase, almost like purchasing a snack at a 7-Eleven store. The consumer client is the most frequent, the client that considers all things for sale. And if he has the money to sell it or to buy it, then what's the harm, what's wrong? There is a strong link between a consumer society or the mentality of a consumer society with the practice of consuming sexual service in the present day situation. There's an apathy and lack of feeling of responsibility in relation to human trafficking. They don't feel like they have any connection to it or any responsibility, that it's something that is very far away from them, that's something that they don't participate in. And their indicators for detecting trafficking, victims of trafficking, were extremely dramatized and sensationalized. So when I asked them, well, how do you know if a woman who you are interacting with is a victim? They would say, oh, if she's in a cage, or if she's tied up, if she's crying, if she has black eyes. Like, they were very dramatic indicators, and it doesn't take into fact that a lot of the coercion and a lot of the mechanism used by traffickers is actually psychological and not necessarily physical, even though that does come into play as well. They deny violence exists due to the situation of prostitution. A lot, when asked about what do they think about the high levels of violence against women who are in the commercial sex industry, they said, oh, these women suffer violence, but it's mainly because of their husbands or their family life. It's not because they're in prostitution. And all of the men in my cohorts became frequent consumers after their first paid sexual experience, despite having negative experience. So even if their first experience with paid sex was negative, they all became frequent consumers afterwards. So with that, I'm going to close a little bit of the new research and data that is related to systemic factors and go into some new statistics and some new studies that I find really interesting about what we know now after 20 years of this anti-trafficking movement. What are some of the new findings and the new focuses and the new strategies to address the issue? So in Mexico specifically, during COVID, the number one form of recruiting victims or trying to capture victims was through false job advertisements, 44% of the cases, which before, for many years before, the number one way of recruiting victims was through false offers of romantic relations, through the trafficker would pretend to be a boyfriend who would seduce the victim and then through manipulation exploit them. And that was a very common case to see, especially within our own programs. We saw that case so many times. But now because of COVID, it actually has changed, and the main form of coercing victims is through false job advertisements. During the pandemic, traffickers began to use social networks as their main way of recruiting. It happened in 22% of the cases that were reported to the institution Consejo Ciudadano, mainly through Instagram and Facebook. They've done a lot of recalculations of the amount of enslaved persons in the world. The Global Slave Index is a great resource. You can actually go by country and you can see what are the main products that are imported that are most likely to be connected to slavery or labor exploitation. You can also see the products from your own country that are exported that are the most likely to have links to human trafficking. And they estimate that currently there is around 40.3 million enslaved persons in the world. And if slavery was a country based on this number, or if it was a US state, it would be roughly the population of Algeria, the entire country of Algeria, or the state of California. And its GDP would be the size of the entire country of Bulgaria or the state of Kansas. And as far as resources, what do we know? We know that the total cost, if we thinking of 40.3 million people who are enslaved, if we take an average cost of $500, which is not that much, in order to provide services and to free these people who are enslaved, the total cost would be $23 billion, which is what Apple made in 3 months in 2021. But what we have as far as funding, funds within the UN, different global institutions that have funding to fight anti-trafficking movements is around 400 million at most, which means we would take about 58 more years to abolish the situation of human trafficking. And as far as human resources, we know the availability of anti-trafficking workers who are specialized in the recovery of victims, it likely mirrors the lowest availability of health workers in certain regions of the world. To address the 40.3 million enslaved people in the world, we would need to put a minimum of 2 million anti-slavery workers into the workforce. This book by Kevin Bales, I don't know if you're familiar with him. He was one of the first researchers to begin to study the issue of human trafficking back before 2000. I believe his first books were from the 90s. I haven't read this book yet. It's on my list, but I heard him at a conference and I found this new research so fascinating that I wanted to share it with everyone here. So I want to cite him and give credit to his research. But what he found in his book called Blood and Earth, what that was a link between the issue of slavery as well as climate change. And I had never heard this connection before, and I found it fascinating. So I want to present you some of his findings in the time that I have left. I'm gonna have to go pretty fast. But in his research, what they found is that through technology, we can actually see 40% of all slavery through space, through global satellites. And how he discovered this was because him as a researcher, he was on the ground in this illegal operation where they were making coal from illegally deforested areas. They were doing illegal deforestation to make this coal. And when he was there on the ground in the late 1990s, he said, this place is so huge, I bet you could see it from space. So when they started developing satellites images, he went in and he saw that from space, that this exact same place where people were being exploited for their labor, they weren't being paid or they were in slave-like conditions, you could be seen from space. This is an image of it from space, from the Google satellite. So using this technology, they went in and they began to identify from these satellite images areas where there could be possible situations of labor exploitation. So how it was done was first they began to map major deforestation from space. So here's a map of Brazil, and all those red areas are where there are major deforestation. And then they started to link those areas of major illegal deforestation with slavery data. And that was done by, this is an example of how that was done. For example, we see here the largest carbon sink in Asia, which has all of these protected areas where deforestation should not be happening. And from a satellite image, they saw this. So this area should be all protected. It should all look like this side on the right, which is green forest, it's untouched. But from the image from space, they saw these buildings, and they said, well, what are these buildings? This should be a protected area. There should be no one there. So they sent in a team of researchers to identify what are these kind of square constructions. They couldn't tell from space what it was. And it turns out that it was an illegal fish farm, and where children were being forced to work to fish, take these fish out of the rivers that flow in that protected area, dry them out on these structures. Those square images that we saw in the satellite image were actually these sort of racks where they were drying fish. And this is fish that you would find typically in cat food or dog food. So for me, it was impactful not only to see how they identified this from space, but also the fact that even if I'm buying my dog food, that small insignificant purchase can actually be linked to slavery as well. And it shows how pervasive the issue of slavery is in our society today. And this is one of the researchers captured this man who was supervising the children and hitting them to get them to go faster. And this is one of the news articles that came out of that research, and they were able to rescue all of the children from that situation and close down the operation. But within his same book, and seeing how these major areas of illegal deforestation not only contribute to slavery, but they also contribute to climate change. So Kevin Bales, the researcher, along with climate scientists, began to do calculations of what would be the hypothetical amount of carbon emissions coming from this fictitious country of slavery, or this group of, or this phenomenon called slavery. So, and what they found was the top carbon emissions by country first comes from China, then the United States, and in third place is this country, or this fictitious country of modern day slavery. We see it here in third place. So that's huge. We see that this issue isn't just an issue of human rights, it's also related to our planet, the well-being of our planet. These are some of the statistics. China 7.52 billion tons of carbon emission, US 7.28, and slavery 2.54. So it creates more carbon emissions than the entire country of India or Canada or Great Britain. So what is the proposal in this specific case? The suggestion for action is that all of these people who are freed from slavery could replant the forests that have been deforested at a living wage, at a fair wage, and that could generate more than $27.9 billion in carbon credits, more than enough to end slavery. And the good news is it's already happening. They've already begun some of these initiatives in Brazil for replanting forests that have been cut down due to illegal activity. So that is one of the studies I found really fascinating. We can see how these systemic issues are all really connected. We can't say, oh, I only care about human trafficking and not, climate change is not my focus, or that's not my main area of concern, because we see that everything really is interconnected. So with that, I am going to finish. I think we have some time still for questions or comments or observations. I would love to hear what you're taking away from this this activity. And thank you so much for the opportunity to share. I find this research so fascinating that I love being able to share it with others. And I encourage you to go out and read some of these new articles. A lot of them are in Spanish. I do have a bibliography, I believe, at the end. Oh, no, I have one and I will mail it to you. Or I actually put some of the citing directly into the presentation that I can share
Wonderful.
Afterwards.
Thank you so much, Nicole. I have to tell you, your passion comes through so clearly. And the scope of the information you provided to us is just incredible. It feels like we just took a class. The way you explain it, the linkages you draw between everyday life, the things that we're doing, and then also the bigger picture that can sometimes feel maybe distant from us. So it's just incredible, but your passion is the thing that I think really impacted me the most. There's some really interesting questions in the chat box as well that I'd love you to be able to tackle. But one of the things I wanted to say to you before you do that is this. Oftentimes human trafficking can feel like it's very distant. It's very removed from people's everyday lives if they're not seeing it, researching it, supporting people who are affected by it. And what you did was you brought it home to much closer to where we are, the actions that we take on a daily basis. Some people find it just overwhelming and kind of avoid it because it is very overwhelming and very devastating as a reality. But what you did was you helped us think about how we intersect with it, how it's related to so many different aspects of our lives. And I think that's the power of what you can do, because oftentimes people disconnect from a larger ecosystem when they feel helpless or they feel like there isn't much that they can do. And you gave us tremendous suggestions as to how we can start thinking about it, what kind of an impact we have, and how we can even relate it to or connect it to our everyday lives. So if I could just summarize a couple of the questions and thoughts that came up while you were talking. Most people were really paying attention, and so they didn't have time for the chat box because you presented a very engaging range of information and also some really rich content. So Virginia was asking or thinking about how the cartels influence the law. And I was thinking, systemically, there are lots of relationships there. She was asking, how does El Pozo de Vida work in a system that includes cartels? And then another question was about, wondering the same thing, what is the cartel's influence on this whole reality? It must be a measured risk, but they're curious to think about that. Then Edith was saying, your organization is rescuing and educating women and children. Do the workers experience pushback or even experience danger from the organizations that benefit from human trafficking? So that's something, that was a really interesting question about even you for your own life, how does it impact you? There was a question about dating apps, and do dating apps contribute to human trafficking? And lots of thank yous and credits for how fantastic, how insightful, how excellent the presentation was, how informative the data was, and some gratitude for the potential actions that people can take. Emily was also mentioning the intersections with climate change and seeing it from space. That's really, I would say that's just so different for most people. All right, so any of those points, Nicole, that you'd like to respond to, please go ahead.
Yes, in response to the comments on organized crime and trafficking rings, there is some level of danger there. We don't work directly with traffickers. That would be extremely risky and a very high, well, it'd be a very high level of risk. We did an analysis of the viability and factability of programs. That's part of the log frame methodology. You do the problem tree and then you identify where you're going to intervene. And of the 4 areas that we identified, supply, demand, facilitators, and justice system, the only one we do not work directly with is facilitators, because we consider it to be too high risk. To send staff to work with those populations, it's very dangerous. And so we think the government is the most equipped and the most appropriate to work with those groups, even though there is a lot of corruption. And we have seen a lot of cases where in our safe home for minors specifically, all of the minors are referred to by the government. We don't accept minors without parental consent or without a government referral, because otherwise it can be a form of kidnapping. So we originally had to move our safe house because we found that even though the location was confidential and the only people who knew were in the government, people would start showing up at the door. They started calling on the phone, threatening and wanting to have contact with certain survivors that were in the safe house. So that's where we saw that, okay, someone, we don't know who, but someone within the government is leaking this information. So we never found out who. What we ended up doing in order to protect the survivors as well as staff is we changed locations. We opened a central office, which we didn't have before, where any survivor that comes into our program is received in our central office, and we take them ourselves to the safe house. We don't even ask for a police escort because we weren't sure at what level the information was being leaked. And since that's happened, we haven't had any threats or any issues. None of our staff has ever been hurt, which is wonderful. There is a certain level of risk, especially in our intervention activities. When we are in our community center, we have social workers and psychologists who go and do street outreach and talk to the women, and there can be a certain level of risk there. Nothing has happened, but we do have security protocols. And because many of the women in the red light district here can have factors that are exploitative, don't necessarily have a trafficker who is watching them constantly. Those kinds of cases are not usually on the street. They're usually in closed buildings, so they're harder to identify. So that's one of the ways we're able to have a little bit higher level of protections. The women tend to be a little bit more independent, or they have a relationship that is exploitative, but not at the level of a crime ring. It's their partner or their boyfriend or family members even, but not an entire organized crime ring. Although we have had some of those cases, and those are much more difficult.
Wow.
And I'm trying to remember the other comments.
There's a question about dating apps. Dating apps.
I actually don't know. That would be a very interesting study. I haven't seen a case where they were recruited through a dating app. There are online websites where women sell sexual services, where we don't really have the data capacity, even though there's some very interesting organizations in Colombia that started doing a data analysis to try and pull it through an algorithm. They pull certain factors from these ads on websites that sell sexual services to identify risk factors. So I saw a presentation on one, and the algorithm, what they would pull is if the same number was identified to be in multiple locations, as if the woman selling sex was moved around a lot, if the same language was used repetitively, or if there were multiple ads associated to the same phone number, could also be a sign that someone is controlling or someone is organizing or exploiting them. They did analysis of the language, the location, and then the amount of times a victim was gone and reappeared in a different location. So through algorithms, they were able to generate a sort of which were the ads that were most likely to have factors of exploitation. And then that was turned over to the police, who then would investigate, or the cyber police. So there are programs that are taking a more of a technological aspect, kind of like what we saw in the satellite images, but this analyzing information online. So there's various organizations that do that. There's the Techs Against Traffickers, I believe it's called, and the Human Trafficking Analysis Hub that do those kinds of researches.
I would say one of the things that you shared with a group that they really probably didn't know before and are really benefiting from is that there is a lot of activity. It was very interesting that you mentioned that it's really the 20th anniversary of this very conscious press against human trafficking. And I think that's something that's, I suppose, a hopeful piece of information for a lot of folks, that if they really are interested in making this a part of how they go through the world, being conscious of human trafficking, being conscious of how it impacts their lives, and, whether or not they're supporting the good health and well-being of all, and wanted to choose a group to maybe become involved with, that there are a lot of initiatives going on worldwide, and all they have to do is sort of scratch the surface. There's more than people imagined. And I think that's a very optimistic and positive thing to learn. And so I really appreciate you sharing that with us.
Yes, and there's a lot of small things we can do to fight trafficking that doesn't mean we have to leave our jobs and go work abroad or anything. Just changing our practices of consumption, I think, are extremely important. Even if we just change one product. You know, I'm only going to buy coffee that is fair trade certified. Or I'm only going to buy chocolate. That can have a huge impact. Researching what are the products that we buy that can be linked to trafficking. I had never thought that cat food and dog food, that seems overwhelming to me, because now every time I buy food for my little dog, I think, oh, I hope this is not linked to some sort of trafficking or child slavery situation.
Yes.
Some products are very hard to be able to connect, but there are very good resources as far as fashion. There are other online libraries that track the supply chain, and they tell you which products. Yes, the Global Slavery Index is a great resource. There's also a program, an online program that can calculate the amount of slaves that work for you. I believe that's what it's called. So you put in some of your purchasing practices, what kind of food you buy, how many times a year you buy fast fashion, and it will calculate, or how many times you change your phone. That's a big issue, that a lot of the pieces of phones are made from people who are in exploitative situations. So I try not to change my phone ever, or I only use used phones. Is a way. There isn't a fair trade phone, but we can maybe not purchase the next phone every time it comes out. You know, use it or buy it used is a way that I try to modify my personal living practices to reflect my work, because I found that there was a dissonance if I'm working with survivors in my 8 to 5 and then go home and I buy fast fashion, or I buy chocolate that was made by a child that was enslaved. So I try and have it permeate, but just those practices are actually very powerful. A lot of times we think we have to dedicate our entire profession, but if we practice our day-to-day activities, that can have a huge impact.
Well, we are very inspired by your passion, by your actions, and by the amount of information you've shared with us, including the definitions of trafficking that have been listed, you know, in Mexico. That was really a place for us to start in terms of thinking about it. Nicole, thank you so much for your time, for your preparation and the time that went into this presentation, for the volume of information you shared with us. You've given us enough to really think about and act on for a long time to come. And we really, really appreciate you. If there's any way that we can continue with you in terms of contributing to your work, if there's anything you'd like us to share broadly within our communities in terms of information and awareness about the work of El Pozo de Vida, your programs, or just trafficking in general, you know, we would be happy to do that.
Great, thank you so much. I'm putting my email in the chat. It's also on the slides. I believe Nancy already has the slides and she is free to share them. And anyone who has questions or comments can also email, and I will gladly respond.
Thank you so much. Muchísimas gracias. And we wish you well and hope you have a lovely holiday period. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you everyone for joining. We will see you in a couple of days. Take care.